And it's also another to hear the authors present and also go beyond the papers and talk a little bit about what motivated them to do their research and how their work can be extended in new theoretical and empirical directions. So I know from my perspective, I really enjoy this a lot. I'm sure you have as well. We have 4 remaining papers, all very exciting. And so we'll go in the order in which they are listed. And this session title is called Diversity of Outcomes in Destination States. We'll have Richard Alba and Nancy Foner first. Matt Wright speaking on behalf of Irene Bloomrad and Matt. Catherine Donato speaking on behalf of her team. And Ralph Coote speaking on behalf of his co-author. So we'll go in that order, and then we will have the brilliant Monica Lloyd serving as discussant. So as typical, 15 minutes each, and I will just keep time.
Okay, well, thank you. I just first want to start by just that Richard and I are going to share this, so I'm going to go first, even though it is Alba and Foner in alphabetical order. And I just want to start out by saying that I have very warm feelings. I want to congratulate the Center for Migration Studies and International Migration Review. I have very strong and warm feelings towards IMR. I was thinking as I was sitting out there that I had an article that states me in IMR in the 1970s, and I've been involved with IMR since then. And I want to congratulate all the people involved with IMR over the years. And also I want to thank the editors of the volume, Jennifer, Jorgen, and Ellen. Those were the editors who read our paper, for their comments, and so thank you. So I want to start out just by, I'm going to give some basic background of the talk. That's my job. Although this is an equal, an equally co-authored paper, I'm going to start out with some basic background about the study. Then I'm going to pass it on to Richard, who's going to look at the reasons for our choosing low-status immigrant groups to look at. He's going to evaluate the 3 grand narratives or ideas, or 3 of the 5 grand narratives or ideas that we look at, what they illuminate and what they obscure, and then make some concluding comments. So what is the main theme of the article? We evaluate in the article what we call the relevance of what we call grand ideas or narratives. And these are ideas that attempt to provide all-encompassing explanations for the success or lack of success of the integration of immigrants and their children. What are these grand ideas or narratives? There are 5 that we look at. One is nationally specific models of integration, like French republicanism or Canadian multiculturalism. A second is the nature of the political economy, in this case social welfare states versus liberal market economies. The third is national history as a settler society, and that's, of course, we have in mind Canada and the US. Fourth, US exceptionalism. And fifth, an inevitable trend towards convergence among Western democratic societies. What countries do we compare? I should say this draws on our larger comparative study of immigrant integration, and to give a plug for our forthcoming book, it draws on our study which will appear in 2015 by Princeton University Press, called Strangers No More, Immigration and the Challenges of Integration in North America and Western Europe. And we look at 4 countries in Western Europe: Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, 2 in North America, the US and Canada. All 6 have experienced, as we all know, huge immigration of immigrants in the post-World War II period. They represent a range of institutional approaches to immigration, and there's a sizable literature available on immigrants and their children in each, and Richard and I have, of course, written together, if you put us together, we have written about all of them. Why compare? Just a few words on this. We've heard of obviously there have been other comparative papers today. We said, among the reasons that we offer for the value of a comparison of this kind is that it offers a yardstick by which a society can evaluate how well it is doing in integrating immigrants and their children. It reveals features of societies that might otherwise be taken for granted or ignored if we only look at one society on its own. And it also lends itself to ideas about borrowings. So, with those beginning comments, I'm going to now pass it over to Richard. See, Richard, I kept it. We had this whole thing about how long we were going to be, right? And Richard kept on saying I was going to be very long, and I did.
Now you can stop. Okay, so let's see here. I'm hoping I'm not going to need to pull for Brianna, but I think I'm okay. Where do I go here? Down the path?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, very good. Well, Nancy had her tribute to the IMR, and I'd like to say something too, though it's not so much about the IMR, but about its founders, Archbishop Silvano Tomasi and Father Lidio Tomasi. And, you know, I think what they've done is so remarkable in so many ways. In 1964, before the Hart-Celler Act, who thought about immigration? So they were really far-sighted. And we've known each other for at least 30 years, maybe more, you know. And so I really come to this with a tremendous appreciation for what you have both done. And I think it is extremely rare, in my experience, to find what one finds in the Center for Migration Studies and in IMR, and that is a combination of, I'll call it, religiously inspired altruism with scientific rigor and intellectual Catholicity, if that's the right word, but I mean it with the small c, of course. And you know, you've built an institution that has endured and that has made major contributions to the field of immigration studies. It is the preeminent journal in this field, and I just think it's a tremendous accomplishment, and I wanted to express that personal view. Okay, so my charge is to kind of run very quickly, to give you an overview kind of what we're saying about how much the grand narratives tell us, and the bottom line answer is not a lot, really. We focus, as we said, on low status groups, and you can see the definition of low status groups there. So it combines, you know, kind of very modest beginnings in the receiving society with kind of ethno-racial distinctions that are potentially stigmatizing for the group. And there are two reasons that we focus on these groups. One is that these are the groups for whom integration is the most challenging, and yet at the same time, they're groups that are really important numerically at a minimum in these receiving societies. The other is a kind of a methodological reason, you might say, and that is, if we focus on groups that have very similar origins, we're in a sense controlling for group origins. It helps us then to place greater focus on the ability of the different societies to integrate these groups more or less. Okay, so what do we do in the book and the paper? I don't know how well this shows up, not terribly well here, but we look at really a range of institutional domains in which integration can be taking place. And we identify those groups in each society and each domain who seem to be facing the most challenges in terms of integration, and those groups, those societies where integration seems to be proceeding most problematically, and those societies where it seems to be proceeding least problematically. And if you simply look across this table, you can immediately get one of our basic findings is there's a lot of variation. There's not a great deal of consistency as we look from one institutional domain to another. And I'll make more of that point as I go along. So, okay, so now how do we evaluate these grand narratives? I'm going to give some quick examples, maybe 3, but it might only be 2, depending on how much time I have. So certainly one of the ideas that has proven very attractive as a form of grand narrative is the idea of models of integration. These are presumed to be national models of integration, such as French republicanism, Canadian multiculturalism, the German ethno-cultural model. I mean, the interest in these models of integration traces back at least as far as Rogers Brubaker's path-breaking account of citizenship differences between France and Germany. And so the presumption here is that these models of integration provide sort of different patterns in each society of incorporating immigrants and their children, which can be more or less successful. What we find in our book and summarized in our paper is that yes, one can see the impacts of these models of integration in certain domains. For example, in the domain of identification with the receiving society, it's clear that there are national differences that seem to articulate with the models. So for example, French republicanism stresses the idea of identification with France and to the exclusion of identification with the ethnic group. And the consequence is a kind of retarded identification on the part of many immigrant populations because of the difficulty they have of sort of integrating for themselves then their sense of identification with their place of origin and with their new society. We also find the impacts of these models in citizenship regimes and also in voting and political integration. But there are a lot of other areas where these models don't seem to work very well. And we think, and this is really a kind of a critical conclusion, you might say, from the study, is that these models simply do not jive with the nature of the key institutions in certain domains of these societies, like the educational system, let us say, which often took place before really mass immigration began. So consider the German school system, for example. So we find that the children of low-status immigrants do not do well educationally in Germany. This is not a big surprise. It's rather well known. And we're not unusual in attributing this to the very stratified nature of the German school system, which forces children at a very early age, at the age of 10, into one of three education tracks that then has tremendous consequences for their educational attainment and for their future role in the labor market. This three-tier structure long predates the onset of post-World War II immigration to Germany. So it doesn't really make sense to think of it in terms then of a model of integration that arose really in the post-World War II era. Another what many have found a very compelling idea are the presumed differences between social market and liberal market economies. And the argument here, made by many social scientists, is that the social market economy should provide a more favorable context for integration because the stronger social net and the stronger regulatory hand in the labor market should protect especially low-status immigrant families from the vicissitudes of the labor market. As you can see from the slide, the countries we're interested in divide evenly between the social market and the liberal market economies. Again, what we see is this idea has some traction, but its traction is very limited in our view. So it is true, as one would expect, that the labor force participation and the employment of immigrants is higher in the liberal market economies, where immigrants cannot avoid working because there's no strong social net to support them should they not work. But when we look at even other economic domains, this idea doesn't work very well. So for example, yes, as one would expect, immigrant income is weakest in the US, but it's strongest in Britain, which is a liberal market economy, as well as in the Netherlands, which is a social market economy. Okay, I'm being told I better get going. Okay. All right, so let me just quickly deal with U.S. exceptionalism. After all, this is a U.S. audience primarily, so I think, so our view is that the U.S., while seen by many here as exceptional, based in part on its history of assimilation, as exceptional in offering opportunity to immigrants and their children, really is no longer very exceptional. Now, it's true that the U.S. hosts the largest immigrant population in the world, at least when we talk about absolute numbers. It's also true that the U.S., like Canada, is very quick to extend the national identity to immigrants, to wrap them, if you will, in that form of warm embrace. However, when we look at a lot of other areas, the U.S. really doesn't do very well. In fact, it's right near the bottom in terms of immigrant economic welfare, residential segregation, second generation educational success. So if the grand narratives don't help us very much, what should we be looking at? So, and our argument is that we should look partly at the characteristics of the immigrants coming in, of course, but we really need to pay more attention to sort of institutional logics and institutional history in particular domains. And let me use religion, which we talk about a fair amount, as an example of this. So one thing we consider in the paper and the book is, why is religion so salient as a social cleavage in Western European societies, but not in the US or in Canada for that matter? Well, yes, there's a demography of immigration, plays a role. Muslim immigrants are very small in number coming to the US. The bulk of the immigrant population is in fact Christian, or becomes Christian after arriving here. But then there's the relationship of the state to religion, which has a different history and institutional configuration today in the United States and in Western Europe. So while the state-church relationship in the U.S. has certainly been contested, there is, constitutionally, no established church in the U.S., whereas in the Western European societies, there was an established church. And even if there has been some separation of church and state, as for example there has been in France, it's still the case that the state and church are entangled in ways that makes it difficult for Islam to gain full acceptance on the religious scene, and for Muslim immigrants, therefore, to feel that they are really equal to the other residents of the societies where they live. My favorite example is France, which of course, as we all know, emphasizes the idea of laicite, and always points to the 1905 law separating church and state, a law that gave the state ownership of all the churches, then existing churches in France, which it must maintain and allow the members of these congregations to use, while at the same time denying the possibility of the state investing in the construction of new religious institutions. So the physical landscape of France is one where there are these magnificent churches and no one attends them. Forgive me, Silvano, with the Bishop Marcio. And then there are these kind of nondescript mosques, that have large numbers of North Africans and other Muslims attending them. So I'm gonna end at that point, but please, I hope you'll buy the book.
Sweet. How's it going? I'm here on behalf of myself as well as Irene Bloomrad, who a lot of you know, and I'll just say at this point, I know from your perspective, this is kind of like, I blinked there. This is kind of like booking the Beatles and winding up with the Monkees, but I'm gonna do what I can. So I gotta say my thanks first of all, the same way everybody else has, right? And duly, right? I want to thank the editors for making this happen for us. It was truly a big deal for us to be a part of this. I also want to thank More specifically, I want to thank them for their comments, which did actually improve the manuscript a great deal. In 2 ways, right? I can tell you we were able to reduce the number of arguments and topics we covered to well under 2 dozen, which is important. And the other thing we were able to do is make the argument a little bit less, the methodology a little bit less opaque, I think. Hopefully, anyway, we'll see. I also want to thank CMS for putting on this event because, so there's been a lot of talk about how people, all of this is about people. And we often forget that, when we submit to journals, that journals are made up of people too, right? We sort of think of them as grist for tenure files and sort of, that, not all of us, I'm sure. Some of us have thought about it like that. And it's nice to see that journals have stories, right? And that there are reasons and all that. So, I feel like I've gained a little bit something from that. So, oftentimes in the actual paper, it's not here I noticed, but a pro tip for those of you who are new at this game, you can tell where the author's sensibilities lie by looking at where they put quotation marks, right? And so we, in the title, the actual title of the paper, there was utter failures in quotes, which may betray a slight sympathy for the sort of idea that that's probably not true, although I'm not necessarily sure we're willing to go so far as unity out of diversity. And I'm happy to talk about that. Our point here is to tackle this issue of multiculturalism. The reason we use utter failure as a kind of a foil is because this is kind of common in politics, right, as well as in the discipline. So by multiculturalism here, I want to emphasize that I'm going a little bit differently than focusing purely on these sort of narratives, right? It's a slightly more focused look, although they're obviously related to each other. And we're thinking about it as policies designed to recognize and promote cultural diversity in society. And so multiculturalism is now basically a dirty word in a lot of venues, and it's associated with the failure of immigrants to sufficiently integrate to their host societies, and you see this all the time. So European leaders, most European leaders actually can't distance themselves from the idea of multiculturalism far enough, at least in terms of rhetoric. It's also, and even supranationally, right, I mean, both the UN and the Council of Europe proclaim that multiculturalism as a sort of ethos has failed. So in the academic literature, this is also true, right? You get a strand of people that are in the process of trying to argue that multiculturalism has all these pernicious effects, right? That it undermines national allegiance. There's people like David Miller and Christian Yaka and people like that. Also, others sort of claim that it undermines linguistic and economic integration, right? Which is a slightly different area that we don't really deal with. And that's Ruud Koopmans and others. And lastly, that it undermines what you could think of as inclusive definitions of national identity among the native-born, and that's some work that I've done elsewhere. Okay, so on the flip side, people, proponents of multiculturalism talk about it as this integrated thing, right? That immigrants can come in and realize that they too have access to the nation as a sort of political community, and this sort of puts them on a plane of equality with the mainstream, right? And this sort of aids integration, at least in a psychological sense. Now, our critique is that most of the multiculturalism is bad literature. Focuses on the mainstream, right, which is totally fine, except that there's less interest in immigrants or less study of immigrants. There is this fixation, I think, with socioeconomic rather than what we call sociocultural integration. It's definitely the, do they get jobs? Do they learn the native? Do they learn the language? Do they do all these kinds of things? And a lot of it's based on case studies and small in-country comparisons. And lastly, there's this other thing which we want to address here more than anywhere else is the idea that multicultural, most sort of critiques are based on, or most of the research is fixated on the first generation, right? And there's also this argument, parallelized argument that second generation immigrants are essentially lost to multiculturalism, that it's an alienating factor for them. So this is just as background and extension of our previous work that came out in 2012, and now so we're extending this to the second generation, but I also want to go a little bit beyond that for the sake of this. But here we want to ask, whether second generation, I'll show data on the first generation as well, but whether they feel more or less included in society. That's our main sort of interest. I'm going to skip through the data. Let's just, believe me, we have a lot of it. It's not all great, and I'm happy to talk about why it sucks during the question, but we do the best we can. Now, so the outcomes that we care about are things that, we lump it under socio-cultural or socio-political integration. Things like generalized trust. These are all things you guys have all heard of, right? Generalized trust. The sense of perceived discrimination, the salience of ethnic and national identities, so there's been talk about identities, we look at that explicitly. Political trust, right, whether or not people trust politicians and the political system, and sort of, expressions about whether or not politicians care, things like that, and also political interest participation. We're not going to do all of that today, but that's been kind of our interest. And I want to emphasize right now that the analyses that I'm going to show you control for, as well as we can, individual level characteristics of immigrants, right? So socioeconomics, education, gender, citizenship, and things like that. We're really more interested in cross-country differences in policy. But first, before I turn to that, I just wanted to show you guys this, which is kind of cool, because I talk about, and so one of the things that I started off by saying is that there is this sort of rhetoric about multiculturalism and how it's become entirely negative. And if you look at actual policy as opposed to rhetoric, you can see over time the sort of modal sort of country has, or the modal pattern is that multiculturalism has actually increased, right, over the past decade, which is the time when it's supposed to have been in retreat. And a lot of countries have no change, but only a couple of countries, Netherlands, Denmark, and Italy, have actually reduced the amount of multiculturalism that they sort of offer. And this is in the Banting-Kimlicka definition of what multiculturalism is. So in terms of policy, things are maybe not as bleak for fans of multiculturalism as the actual rhetoric is. Now, the second thing I want to address just in passing is how multiculturalism policy in the Banting-Kimlicka sense of the word relates to other relevant policies. So there's this whole cottage industry now of citizenship, multiculturalism, immigration indices, right, political indices. And so this is only to show you that my good friend and fellow scholar Sarah Goodman, who a lot of you have probably come across at some point, this just looks at her civics index, which is mandatory integration, right? So indices that measure how strenuously countries enforce the need to learn language, civic knowledge, and things like that, right? And so I show you this just to show you that conceptually speaking, multiculturalism is very different, right? Because it's not necessarily the polar opposite, right? They're orthogonal. But the idea about multiculturalism sort of valorizing cultural difference is it's a very different idea than saying we are going to mandate a certain amount of integration before we hand out citizenship. And that was the case empirically, right? So conceptually they're very different. Empirically in 2000 they were distinct, more or less, distinct from each other. And now they've kind of moved into alignment. The reason why they've moved into alignment is because the sort of less multicultural countries have embraced these policies of mandatory integration. Now, what this means, the reason why I raise this point is I think it's of interest, but it also sort of helps to illustrate the limitations of what we can do empirically, because now these things become more and more collinear, and it's hard to actually know what's doing the work here. Okay, so I'm going to skip over the approach, and I'll just go over the graphs. But basically the idea is that we look across Europe using ESS, and we compare first and second generation immigrants to, it's hard to know what to call them, right? But people who are third generation or beyond, I guess you could call them third gen plus, across regime of multiculturalism. And regime of multiculturalism is simply operationalized by scoring above a certain, above the median on the Banting and Kimlicka measure. And we have thrown a little extra leverage by comparing the U.S. and Canada, which both sort of score highly on citizenship, ease of citizenship acquisition, but are very handle multiculturalism very differently. Okay. So here's ethnic identity, right? Now the first thing that will jump out to you if you've done any kind of empirical analysis at all is that the error bars are absolutely huge. And so this is why the sort of theme of this talk is sort of uncertainty and, need for further research and all this kind of stuff, right? But this is suggestive, right? And this echoes what we found in 2012, which is that essentially, and the relevant bar for you guys probably is going to be the white one, because the white one is just think of it as the one that controls for everything. And so if you compare, and higher is better, right? Or higher is more, I should say, right? And we've got, on the left-hand graph, we've got national identity, right? How close one feels to the nation. And on the right hand, we've got how close one feels to their ethnic identity. So the reason why I like this one, I think is actually really interesting, is it shows that the importance of ethnicity is actually much higher in Canada, which is something that people who talk about multiculturalism would sort of say, yeah, of course, right? And so this shows that although there's overlap in the confidence intervals, fine, but it's a pretty big difference. So I'm going to stand by it. Now, on the other hand, the important contrast, right, is to show the importance of the nation. Sorry, I said it backwards. I could have left it right. The importance of nation is actually more or less the same, right? So the takeaway from this, we think, is that you can have a higher devotion to your ethnicity or a stronger ethnic identity without necessarily compromising whether or not you feel attached to the nation, right? So this is kind of a way of showing that multiculturalism might be doing what everybody kind of says that it does, but not perniciously, right? And so now there's a couple of other ones that I'll just sort of skip through because they're all basically the same, right? You see wide error bars, and the idea is to just show that in terms of generalized trust and other measures, which I'll sort of skip through, there's not actually really that much of a difference between high and low multiculturalism, immigrants in high and low multicultural settings. whether or not they're sort of compared in terms of absolute levels, right? Or whether they're compared in terms of gaps with the mainstream, right? Which is this question, I always have that as part of the analysis because you've got to sort of consider where they're integrating to. That's the whole integrated question. So it's one thing to distrust politicians in France because, everybody hates politicians in France, right? Everybody hates everything in France. So, I'm kidding. So integrating to that rather than integrating to Canada, where there's more sort of deference to politicians, is a very different question, right? But it doesn't actually matter so much in the empirics. And so all I'm going to point to here is that we can see a tiny little bit if you look at the lower graph. The lower graph is in second generation respondents, right? And they sort of are slightly to the left in the high MCP categories and in the low, although well within margin of error, right? So basically zero, but we could sort of start to see maybe the emergence of a parallel lives, and this is something that would be probably downplayed in the data, right? So if we had better data, probably, first of all, the error bars would be smaller, but probably the difference would be exaggerated. So there's something to think about there. And basically the same is true for political trust, right? Where immigrants do pretty much the same in terms of whether they're in high or low multicultural settings. And in the second generation, you see this slight declivity, some of which goes away when you actually control for what how natives respond. And trust in national government. Here is one sort of unambiguously pro-multicultural piece of data, whereby, again, if you look to the right on the white-hand bars, you see Canadian immigrants are much more trusting of national government than American immigrants are. So this is kind of a sign. That's one positive thing that comes out of that. So let me just conclude briefly by saying that, first of all of this is kind of like, it's soft, right? It's soft because the data is not great. But to the extent that we can say anything about multiculturalism, I think it's important to sort of make this argument because the rhetoric around the argument is so charged, right? And there's no neutral party on this, right, in politics. So I think it's important to sort of bring a little sanity to it and say, well, these aren't actually as good or as bad as people sort of think they are, and that's generally been the case for us. That there's no hugely evil thing about multiculturalism, and nor is it a world saver either. So there's not too much of an upside, but there's not really much of a downside either. And the U.S.-Canada comparisons are a little bit more unambiguous because the comparison is cleaner and we have better data, so we can say stronger things about that. So Canadians generally do better in Canada on these kinds of outcomes than Americans do, so we could chalk some of that up to multiculturalism. And this persists into the second generation. So there's some questions remain. There's a huge problem with sampling quality bias, right? And so on that, I'll also add the fact that statistical power is very low, so we need more data. And the second thing is, well, okay, part of the message is, well, can Canadians do better? Is it possible? Would it be possible to sort of embrace strong multiculturalism in other places and sort of accept the same, expect the same result? And that's still an open question. So I think I'll end there, and I'll thank you very much for your attention, and I'll look forward to your comments.
All right, I too need to say something personal. Going to school for my PhD at Stony Brook in the mid-1980s, I was told by my dissertation mentor that I must read every issue of IMR. And of course, you follow what your dissertation mentor tells you. So there were quite a number of years where I read every article in every issue of IMR. And really, this paper comes out of that reading. So it's really sort of nice to have some kind of closure here. I do want to say thank you really to the founders, to CMS. This has been a remarkable resource. Going back 50 years, it will be a remarkable resource, as we know, as more people are on the move now. Or we think, at least, the share-wise there isn't, but we certainly know there are more numbers of people on the move, and we know there seems to be much more trauma in the world pushing people around as perhaps never before, but certainly not recently. All right, so I begin today. I do want to say I would have been unable to do this paper without my co-authors. So let me say Anna Jacobs and Bonica Pierre are right here. They're my graduate students at Vanderbilt. And truly, we had two major issues in generating this paper. One was, how do we deal with all of the data? And two was then, once we generated the models that we felt were worthy, scholarly worthy to actually publish, how do we present the findings so that we're not lost in this morass of numbers and we can get our point across succinctly. So hopefully you'll see that today. What was clear from me was the get-go, what the question would be. And when I received the invitation to write an abstract, to me this was a perfect opportunity, and Bhumika at the time, to say, okay, back in 1984, there was an issue of IMR published on women and migration. And of course, having read every piece in that issue, and knowing Monica Boyd's work, and then seeing how this concept that she put out there in that 1984 issue about the double disadvantage, then living through the last how many decades of scholarship, seeing how that concept has been used, I thought this would be a fabulous opportunity. So we start there. Monica Boyd, who is, I'm a little bit nervous, is now going to comment after after we present. But she's the one who put the double disadvantage idea out there. She described the labor market position of immigrant women in Canada. And since then, there has been a fair amount of studies that have accumulated supporting this idea of this combined negative impact of sex or gender and birthplace. And those studies have described immigrant populations in immigrant women in the United States, in European nations, and in Israel. Yet really very little is known about this double disadvantage and the extent to which it exists around the world. And perhaps it's more important now, I would argue, based on my work, given that the gender composition of the world's migrants continues to be, for the last couple of decades, it's been at parity, at about even, and it continues to be even, or in many countries around the world now, there are more women entering as migrants than men. So we wanted to reconsider the double disadvantage. We are really asking whether and how it exists for immigrants and in the United States, and that's the first half of our analysis, and then we will look at data for Brazil, Canada, Greece, Israel, Malaysia, Spain, South Africa, and Venezuela. And we are, of course, looking at the effect of nativity, we're looking at the effect of gender, but then we're also factoring in marital status, which is something we hadn't seen done before, but we actually found, I think, some very interesting results. So we're asking, are there gender differences among immigrants, and are they larger than among natives? We're asking, are immigrant women disadvantaged relative to both native-born women as well as native and foreign-born men? And to what extent does marital status help us explain those differences? So I'm not going to read this slide. We're emphasizing marital status. And in the United States, there's a very large literature about the effects of gender, or how gender helps differentiate labor force participation in the U.S., what people receive for work, whether it's wages, how much they work, hours, etc. And globally, there's been more of this research globally as well, suggesting overall one of the main points, which has been recently in the New York Times, I think 2 weeks ago, is that there's a marriage bonus for men, and there's no bonus, and there's a penalty for women. And that, you know, so this, even though this is a migration, study, this is about immigrants, and the part of the double disadvantage is about nativity, we're also thinking about the gender literature and what social scientists have said there. So our expectations is that all three of these variables are key stratifiers, and that marriage especially may exacerbate or amplify immigrant women's disadvantage, and we might see impacts by receiving nation, by national origin, and you can read our specific expectations there. But marriage will moderate the double disadvantage, and that's how we start. We're using a lot of data here.
for any one of us who like data. You can read this slide per se, but one of the really, truly remarkable sources of data, international data that didn't exist before, is the IPUMS, which the Minnesota Population Center has not only harmonized across years of U.S. census, so these are census data across the U.S., across all the decades, but that kind of harmonization now exists for census data from around the world. And they are actively going to nations and getting census data. And so as a result, the IPUMS, whether it's IPUMS US or IPUMS International, is an amazing source of data that we didn't have 20 years ago, certainly not at this level. And it is truly incredible the amount of nations that are available. I just finished writing a book using all of the IPUMS International data on gender and migration, looking at some immigration questions. So we here had to make some tough decisions. What we decided was to focus our US story on using census data starting from 1960 moving forward to 2010. And then we had to make some tough decisions about which countries around the world. And again, we're thinking about immigrants in those countries. And so we decided on the set that you see here in the slide, partly because these are immigrant receiving nations. They may not be receiving as many in absolute number as the United States, by no means, but still these are sizable populations of immigrants around the world, and they help us understand the extent to which gender, nativity, and marriage matter in labor force participation. So we have our strategy really is just to begin, look at labor force participation, and I should say here, we're only focusing on that one outcome for now. I'm writing a proposal. We're going to expand to look at a wide variety of outcomes. This is just the beginning, but we thought we need really one acceptable outcome to begin to look across countries to get sort of a handle on what the data globally are saying. So we're going to look at whether and how labor force participation varies by those three stratifiers. We're going to predict then in these regression models what are the odds of participating in the labor force as a function of all the achieved and ascribed attributes that we can use, that census data around the world permit us to use, and that reflect how attractive workers are to employers, and then in the models, which we're not going to show, the models then have I don't know how many interaction terms, but essentially we need to sort of control for the changing skill set of workers over time in the U.S. Since we start in 1960, we need to change for we need to control for the increase in women in the labor force since 1960, but our key focus are on the interactions, a three-way interaction between gender, nativity, and marital status. And then we try to replicate that analysis. So let's go into findings. So this is for the U.S. We're just think about this as what are the differences between foreign-born? You can see at the very bottom, we have foreign-born in the solid lines, women and men, women in red, men in blue, and then the dotted lines refer to, in the same color scheme, women U.S.-born and then women women U.S.-born and men U.S.-born as well. And so you can see in these two panels, the very bottom line, the lowest line on the figure, is a solid line, and that refers to foreign-born women. And they, in the first panel, where we're not controlling for everything, we can see they have the lowest labor force participation compared to the other three groups. And then in panel B, we actually add these interactions to control for changes in the labor force. And even there, you can see the changing trend in some of these lines, but you still see that foreign-born women, which is that red solid line, had lowest labor force participation rate until about 1990. And in 1990, their labor force participation doesn't differ from from U.S.-born women. And then the other kind of interesting thing for the bottom figure is that you see that the gap between women and men, whether foreign-born or U.S.-born, narrows very substantially until about 1990, and then it remains at about that level thereafter. So now in this figure, we're now beginning to look at this three-way interaction, or what we're controlling for that. Again, we're trying to assess how different these stratifying mechanisms operate. And here, again, the very bottom line in the figure, foreign-born women, but these are now married. And then the line right above it are U.S.-born women who are married. So you can see married women's labor force participation is lowest. And then you can go up, sort of go from bottom to top. Then you can see foreign-born unmarried women in the solid pink line, and you can see the gap between them and U.S.-born unmarried women is very narrow, right? So you can see a bigger gap for married foreign-born U.S.-born women than you do for unmarried. And then what's interesting is that for men you have the same. A similar pattern, except at the very top line, where you have foreign-born men who are married. That's the very top solid line, and then foreign-born, and then U.S.-born who are married. I wonder if this. No, it doesn't work here. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here you can see a very small difference, right, between these two. Between these two groups at the very top. Now I can't see it again. Here it is. But again, the difference, the nativity, the marriage difference is very small. Let's go here. So now we're trying to, again, just what's the chance of being employed in the labor force, participating in the labor force? And I think what you can see in panel A is that for some countries, look at Spain, look at Greece, look at Malaysia, you can see there's a very big gender story here. A very clear gender divide. But the gender divide is less so in Israel and in South Africa. And in all 5 countries, right, you do see that men and women's labor force participation rates are really not that different for natives and between natives and foreign-born. You see some nativity difference, but then for some countries, for women in South Africa, you see no difference. For women in Greece, you see no difference. But you do see some difference, for example, in Malaysia, where foreign-born women actually have higher labor force participation rates than native-born women. In panel B, for Canada and Brazil, the gender differences, I think, are really more moderated by nativity than you saw for the countries in panel A. Venezuela is one exception. Here you can see the 2 blue bars and the 2 red bars are really quite dramatically different. They're very polarized outcomes. In the U.S., you also see a clearly gendered story, but you see, again, very little nativity difference. Finally, here we're layering on now, right, marital status. So the hatched bars, right, refer to foreign-born, they refer to native-born men, foreign-born men who are unmarried, and then the hatched red bars or pink bars are native-born women, foreign-born women who are unmarried. And again, here you see marriage is salient, but it operates differently. So let's just take Spain, which is what I've written down here at the bottom in text, just to orient you to what this figure is saying. From the figure before that we just saw, for foreign-born and native men, about 80 to 82% were in the labor force. But here, married native men's labor force participation is actually comparable to foreign-born men. So, and unmarried natives have lower rates than unmarried foreign-born men. Take, I think, one of the interesting cases here is Malaysia. Malaysia is a big attractor of immigrants in the region. It's a big regional destination for immigrants. And you can see by just looking at the shape of the bars, you have a story that's really a marital status story for women. And yet, because you see these big gaps, right, between between married women who are the solid, not hatched bars, and then the hatched bars in pink are for unmarried. So you see this big divide there. But for men, you see far less of a divide between married and unmarried. And for men, it's much more a story about nativity. The final thing I'll note here for Malaysia is that the very last bar to your right, you can see foreign-born women who are unmarried in Malaysia have the highest labor force participation rates out of any of the women, and as well comparable rates for some of the various groups of men. So what we've tried to do here is to convince you that in some nations the double disadvantage exists. We've also tried to convince you that marital status is extremely salient in these conversations, and such that the double disadvantage is a much more complex concept than I think we've recognized in the past. And that means we may want to revisit the idea that immigrant women are either only disadvantaged by nativity or gender, or doubly disadvantaged and not more or not less if you only look at labor force participation. So we want to extend this analysis now, and not only looking at the rewards or the benefits of work, as in wages and hours and prestige of the actual jobs that people have, but we want to do a much bigger global look and thinking, look at these issues, thinking about this both regionally and globally, worldwide as well, to get sort of better leverage on what's going on in Africa and the extent to which, for example, in South Africa, some of what's happening in South Africa is driven by more regional migration dynamics. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and like everyone else, I'd like to start, of course, with thanking the IMR, the editors, for their support and for the comments we got on this, developing this paper, which we now have in the special issue. So the question is, does cultural diversity of migrant employees affect innovation? So why don't I give you straight away the answer? The answer is yes. The effect is modest. The effect is very hard to measure. And there's still a lot more to be done. But perhaps you'd like to hear a little bit more. So let me first introduce my collaborators. Two of them are here, Jaron Oskin and Cornelius Peters, and two others, Peter Nijkamp and Anna-Katrien Nieboer, were not able to be here. Now, when we're talking about diversity, I'm happy to say that we practice what we preach, because this is a paper with 5 authors. I think we've got the gender balance right, we've got cultural diversity, different countries represented, so that was, in fact, I guess, a good start. Well, this project is actually part of a larger, it's actually, there was a larger project that's actually finished at the end of last year, the Migrant Diversity and Regional Disparity in Europe project, Media Ready. And in that project, which involved a number of countries, besides us as author, there's actually also Estonia and Finland collaborators in that overall project as well. And it also covered a wider range of questions than the question of innovation, although we are all economists. So the key question of that broad research program was, does the presence of migrants from diverse range of backgrounds in a region or within a firm boost innovation and productivity? And then we had a range of projects, some of them concerned with productivity and also a wide range, some with innovation, some with patents, some with pan-European data, some with global macro data even. So in this paper, however, we will focus on both a synthesis of the existing literature and moreover we do some new modeling, econometric modeling with data from the Netherlands and from Germany. And when we start this question of why should cultural diversity affect innovation? To answer this question, economists have been able to use the work of classical economists like Ricardo and Marshall, but here in this great city of New York, I'd like to mention the late Jane Jacobs, who's there on that picture, because she argued that it was precisely diversity of the inhabitants of a city and their businesses that yield important economic advantages or agglomeration, leading to what one book by Ed Glaser calls the triumph of the city. And of course the city has always been the magnet of migrants, who thereby contributed to virtuous circle of growth. But when we talk about catchy titles of books, I would also like to mention, that's also in the picture there, the second book is called The Difference, How the Power of Diversity Creates Better Groups, Firms, Societies and Schools. That's by Scott Page. And that book puts forward the argument very powerfully that the diversity of a group of people is able to solve problems much better than individuals, even by individual excellence. So, however, there are ways in which cultural diversity affect a workplace performance in a number of ways, positive and negative. And I must admit that to some extent economists have been rather latecomers compared with, for example, human resource management people and psychologists in looking at this particular issue. So there are both benefits and costs, and they're here in the slide. I can't really go into details in discussing them. I think that it's important to make a distinction between costs and benefits both at the firm level, and in fact our data are going to be on what happens within the firm, but there are also of course broader society issues that economists refer to as externalities. And so it's both of those on both sides we have positive effects, such as positive externalities of the benefits of the strength of weak ties and bridging social capital. Some of you may work with the work of Renovator, of course. We've got, of course, within the firm, the decision making I talked about before, issues of resilience, positive self-selection. But on the negative side, of course, the term introduced by Alessina, fractionalization, is an issue that can affect communication, trust, treatment, mobility. There is also external costs when the bonding capital actually leads to some kind of exclusion or polarization. So now, before we look at the actual evidence, we need to ask ourselves, what do we mean by cultural diversity? And of course, it's a multidimensional concept. Objective indicators may include birthplace, ethnicity, race, language, ancestry, religion. People such as Steve Vertevec of the Max Planck Institute now talk about superdiversity, indicating that it is multidimensional. In fact, that it's hard to actually put in your econometric models, and instead most people, and the research that we review shows this very clearly, still go for very simple measures like the share of migrants, or something called the fractionalization index or an entropy index, or simply counting the number of different cultures present in a particular workplace. There's not really any time to review now the 24 studies or so that we review in the paper. I hope you'll read the paper to find out about that. But what actually is interesting, that most of the research to date that looks at the diversity impact within the workplace has been conducted in Europe. And the possible reason for this is that statistical agencies in Europe have permitted the linking of various survey instruments with administrative data such as tax and population registration data. One area outside Europe where this is now also happening is actually in New Zealand, where we have something called the integrated data infrastructure to do this. So besides the linking of and the comparison of census data that was just referred, there's all sorts of new developments in a whole lot of quantitative research areas, which I think are very encouraging. If I simply count the various conclusions of the studies conducted to date, the bottom line is that there is quite a lot of evidence of positive effects, although there are also some studies that find no effect, or even some that find negative effects. Let me, of course, before I perhaps go into the data that we've used, there is of course also the difficult issue of causality. We've already talked in previous presentations, there's correlation versus causation. And there are the ways in which this can be dealt with, and I'll talk a bit about that. Economists, of course, are very concerned that there could be a sort of sorting, that firms that are very innovative and workers, migrant workers looking for good opportunities, where they kind of match and sort themselves to in particular areas that are very innovative. So we can have a reverse causation. Clearly we want to control for that. So in the Netherlands and in Germany, we had some really interesting these integrated data sets that we could use for this. And the research question of our project, because we had been independently working on this before, doing German research separately from the Dutch research, but in this paper, our research question was, if we design our statistical analysis to be as closely as possible a replication in one country of the work in the other, would we then get similar results? And the classic economist answer is yes, but it depends. So we did merge the data in both countries, and tell you a little bit about some of the descriptors before we get to the results, but also I'd like to point out that this is actually not an easy task, because this data is highly confidentialized, and therefore it can only be looked at at one terminal, and so the collaboration had to be by email, and it was not possible to look at the data or even look at raw results. Only tables had to be, after they were released, they could actually discuss the results. So that makes it also time consuming, of course. Now, so here you see some of the data. So this fractionalization indexes, this index that Alessina introduced, where you take the fraction of people of particular cultural background, square it, and you sum all that, you take 1 minus that. Have I lost you already? Then you get this fractionalization, which basically is an index of diversity. So the higher the level, the more diversity. And in fact, you do get differences there between the two countries, which partly to do with also measurement issues. In the Netherlands, actually, we used country of birth. In the German case, we had to rely on nationality to measure of cultural diversity. Okay, well, let's get them back to the bottom line. The result is that a coefficient of about 0.1 is what we find, and it's quite similar for both countries, but it's not statistically significant in Germany, whereas it is in the Netherlands. Maybe because the German sample is much smaller. It's about half of the size of, in the end, what we dealt with. So maybe it's an issue of sample size. There is also an issue about, if you look within a firm, you could, because we have panel data, so we can follow a particular firm over time. Then that would be a very powerful way of looking at it, because you control for what we call unobserved heterogeneity among firms. But what you then find is that over a period of, say, 6 years, the composition of employment in a specific firm doesn't change really all that much dramatically to pick up this effect statistically significantly. So then, of course, we also try to address the reverse causality issue by means of what economists refer to as instrumental variables, which are things that affect the cultural diversity but do not have a direct link with innovation. When you do that, we actually found, in order to do that technically correctly, we had to use slightly different instrument in the Netherlands as in Germany. When you do that, we do get still the positive effect of life cultural diversity on innovation, but it's now that it switches It's no longer statistically significant in the Netherlands, so there it seems as if the correlation was dominating the causation, but in the German case, the causation dominates the correlation, so that was really interesting. So let me now get to the conclusions of this, which is that we do find a small positive effect, but to quantify it remains challenging. Clearly, replication and extension across a wider range of countries, I believe, is now desirable. This is also an area where, in fact, disciplines have not been interacting very well, and cross-disciplinary integration of diversity research should be very fruitful here, we as actually jointly believe. For example, the roles of the organizational structures, the institutional settings, the types of tasks, and the specific channels of diversity impacts that we had on the slide before are still to be examined thoroughly. If cultural diversity can be shown to have positive impacts on innovation and firm performance generally, this will of course then also trigger questions about what kind of policy responses is best to engage with this particular empirical result. So maybe my presentation has now raised more questions than answered, but if so, I believe our paper has actually served its purpose for a special issue. So thank you very much.
So I'm Monica Boyd from the University of Toronto, and as I said to my husband the last time we moved, I've moved across more damn country borders in my lifetime than I ever want to think about. But that, like most of us in the room, has provided a background that has stimulated an interest in immigration for much of my life. I'm here to discuss the remaining 4 papers for the special issue of IMR on the celebration of its 50th birthday. And I want to begin by some general comments, move to the papers specifically, and then conclude with some general comments. I am going to talk about the papers briefly. I've long had a policy of not trying to offer criticism when in fact something's already in print. And in fact, I find myself in a den of foxes because all of the authors have indicated in various ways that they know what are the strengths of their research, and they know, and they've told you, what are the problems with their research. So I've indeed been scooped. But I will talk briefly about some of the issues that I think remain that come out of the paper. So let me begin a little bit with an observation, because it's important to understand the papers, the 4 papers that you've just heard. This issue was designed to allow people to soar. It was to try out new ideas, and it represents in its entirety, but also one sees it clearly with these 4 papers, a combination of solid and informative literature reviews that situate a problem under study, and it tries out new ways of looking at the correlates and, for the most part, the consequences of immigration. I think we can ask from that perspective what is old, what have we seen before, what is new, what remains by way of work to be done, and what is missing, the latter derivative from the what remains. What is old is the raison d'etre for the establishment of the International Migration Review. And it was said, again, very early on by Archbishop Tomasi, it's not just the importance of ideas, those too can change the world, but it's even as critically, if not more critically, the importance of evidence. And it's the importance of presenting evidence and the final step, assessing the evidence. It's not just saying, Marx says, Jesus says, therefore it is, but it's also trying to assess the validity and robustness of the conclusions that one is drawing from the evidence. All of these papers grapple with this. As they have said in various guises, the evidence or the data that they're working with is not perfect, but all of the authors are to be commended for as I said, not only a really, to use my daughter's terminology, awesome lit review, but also to present and assess evidence on their topic. What is new in the papers? Well, first of all, new data. I found fascinating the innovativeness of all of the scholars in searching across countries, in amalgamating data sets, in going to what will be, in a sense, the critical new forms of data, regrettably excruciatingly expensive to establish, which is panel data, longitudinal data done in your paper. But all of them rely on new uses of data, new forms of data. There's also an emphasis that really was seen in the 25th anniversary issue, but is certainly evident even more so in the papers and in the last 4 papers that you heard, which is new geographies. Europe is without question represented in all of the analyses of the papers, and even in the case of the Donata et al. Paper, other parts of the world. There are also new ways of thinking about issues of integration that we find, in particular the role of institutions and the growing use of political sociology and the notion of welfare state regimes as represented in the works of Alba, Fauner, Wright, and Blumrad. Excuse me. There is cutting across all 4 papers comparative analysis. That goes without saying, but comparative analysis in its strongest form is extremely important because it can act a little bit as an experimental design. It tells you what is constant, and you know then what are the variabilities between your units of analysis that allow you to try to at least do some correlational analysis, if not causal and effect conclusions. Comparative analysis is overwhelmingly important for the audience that IMR originally saw as its main consumer base, notably the United States. What has struck me in my career, flip-flopping back and forth to the United States, is how insular American researchers in the field of immigration used to be. We really have had 2 major epochs in the history of migration research in North America, particularly in the United States. One was getting it on the table. What was said earlier today, and I can't remember who said it, was absolutely correct, which was in the 1960s and early 70s, if you were starting out your career, particularly in the field of population research, international migration in general, was just so boring. Who could possibly be interested in that? It was fertility. It was high fertility rates in developing countries. It was challenging, essentially attempts for economic development, was galvanizing the attention of the United States AIDS program. Immigration was just something that had always been and always would be there, and with a very strong assimilation model, really was not an object of scrutiny. The establishment of IMR, largely through the incredible energies and commitment of both Father Lidio Tomasi and Archbishop Silvano Tomasi, turned that around and was responsible for the growing visibility of immigration in the field in the United States. The fact that around 1983, NICHD came forward with a directed call for proposals on international migration that suddenly turned a number of people who had heretofore been working in fertility into ardent immigration specialists, also contributed to this epiphany and conversion process. But comparative analysis is very important because the United States is the biggest, one of the biggest, it's the wealthiest country in the world, unless you want to put Japan up ahead of it. And it's been very important, I think, to remind scholars that more is better, that to look simply at one narrow spectrum of what is going on in the United States, yes, it's important for the well-being of those immigrants, but in fact says absolutely nothing about the millions and millions of migrants elsewhere. And finally, I would applaud today's panel because what I have seen, and I like it very much, with a proviso, is the growing involvement of economists in the field of immigration. If you go back to the 25th silver anniversary issue, that was when George Borjas, the youngest of us all in this villa in Lago Como, and please could we go back there again, was really just freshly minted and was one of the first people, not one of the first, but he was certainly very committed to the notion of immigration as he or to the study of immigration as he has been throughout his entire career. But the economists have come in, and what I'm particularly pleased about the presentation by, I'm going to call it the Poot et al., which will make you the first author rather than the last, but the Poot et al. Article is the breadth of readership. I very much enjoyed this particular paper. It's helped by the fact that I'm doing an analysis of workers in the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field. And I suddenly realized that I had failed to Google immigration and innovation, but it was all in that paper. I didn't need to struggle anymore to find relevant works. And it was and is incredibly wide-ranging. When you start to talk about Nancy Tommaso's work on organizational theory, a sociologist, and you start to bring in not just national accounts material, which is the bread and butter of a lot of economists, and you talk widely across anthropological, sociological, psychological, human resource literature, it's extremely impressive to read. And I really want to applaud your group, which you said was not interdisciplinary. I thought maybe that was the reason, but it's a very interesting overview, and all of the papers have that. They have a wealth of a literature review. So clearly, everyone was told, we want you to do this state-of-the-art literature review, and by the way, we also want you to be original, right? And original they were. Because what is new is also that they all make their own unique contributions, as I said, using, in many instances, new data sets. The Alba and Fauner piece is, as they have said, and confirmed something I had suspected, a gift to IMR as a summary of a larger project, and I think done not only to make us reflect on what are the conventional narratives, but also it certainly served to tantalize me to want more evidence than what you had presented, and I will certainly get my library to order the book.
Good, that's a start.
The Donato piece, all of these papers are ambitious, and I guess what I would say is that's the good news and that's the bad news. Because not only do they contain these wonderful summary of the state of the field in regard to the specific questions that they're asking, but they're also trying to present new evidence using empirical evidence, using data and assessing that. And sometimes there is simply too much in these papers. And what I mean by too much is that I found myself wishing in virtually all of them, but now I know that Richard and Nancy have this book out, so that's their secret given away, that I found myself wishing that I'd had two articles, that I'd had a really good literature reviews, setting up the problem, and then I'd had a really complete evidence-based analysis of the questions that they were using the data for. It's all there, but it makes for a very tense, or not tense, but it makes for a very packed way of going through things. And that does raise one issue that I think we all need to be reminded, which is sometimes when we have to condense too much, we can make particularly statistical information somewhat inaccessible to a general readership. So if I had to say one criticism of the four, it's that when we get to these wonderful, innovative, empirical kinds of analyses, some people out there simply won't understand it. All of the authors do recoup. They do in the conclusion tell you what the evidence was designed to do, but it gets a little crunched. Somewhat unavoidable, I suspect, given the mandate that they were assigned. I think the other two kinds of general things I would comment on is that in terms of what remains is a message that comparative analysis is hard, and it really is. All of these papers have struggled with how do you compare different countries. And I would suggest that actually if I had my wish list of what I would like to see more of in these comparisons, and no one raised it in their paper presentations, is there was no sense of the differential location of immigrants. We've heard a paper earlier today on the new immigrant cities, the new immigrant locations. But in Canada, for example, we have the Holy Trinity of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And we really do not have much diffusion into other areas, although it is increasing, which makes the analyses anyone does using Canadian data essentially a city data. And you have to know that when you're interpreting the data. And I found myself looking at all of these comments and attempts to compare, kind of saying, well, I'd really like to know where the immigrants are located in France. I'd really like to know where the immigrants are located in Malaysia. The other thing that was missing, and it's again a problem of space, a problem of data sets, is the term nativity, the term immigrants, is used very generally. We have types of migrants. We have undocumented migrants who are captured in data sets. We have people who are in a country temporarily. We have people who are in a country legitimately, but who are not given citizenship rights under existing political regimes. And we have changing migration flows, transformative in the sense that North America now is no longer a European origin, or is no longer being fueled by European origin migration, as we all know, but by Latin American immigration, and more importantly, in the US as well as elsewhere, by migration from Asia. And I found myself really wanting to know not only more about what Cortez on the 25th anniversary called the context of reception, but also where these people were coming from, because it does feed into existing integration narratives, to use that term. So what remains? And here I'm going to say a couple of general things, and then I will let Jennifer take the floor. She's never tried to take it from me, and she can't. Okay, what remains? This goes back to some of the general truths that were said this morning. I mean, one of the difficulties of coming last is that it's all been said, but I'm going to say it again. It's a complicated world out there, and trying to do comparative analysis and comparative research makes it even more complicated. It, by definition, defies the one-size-fits-all conclusions or theory. And in fact, what I found interesting in these 4 papers that were reviewed for you in this session is that actual attempts at theory building are missing. When immigration first became part of the radar screen of social scientists, at least in North America in the 70s and 80s, the social sciences, particularly sociology, and to a lesser extent economics, we're still thinking that there was such a thing as a theory, and there was attention paid to theory building. Now we're using vocabulary like orienting frameworks, grand narratives. We've moved beyond trying to come to these conclusions. And that's good because it reminds us that we need to pay attention to a tremendous amount of detail, because these theories and conclusions and narratives are often overgeneralized. We also, I think, have learned through all of the papers, but particularly in the comparative analysis, that geopolitics is deeply implicated in the instigation of migration, in the flows, and in the settlement patterns of migrants. And I think that that's, again, part of the growing presence of political sociology, political science in the field. I'd like to say what is missing. And this is a general comment kind of on all of the readings, but it also pertains to what in the last section on the diversity of immigrants, with an emphasis on how well they are doing in destination countries that I would have liked to have seen. I've already mentioned types of migrants, that not everybody is cut from the same cloth, and that makes a tremendous difference in integration issues, in integration policy, and in the experiences of immigrants themselves. I'm somebody whose training was in survey fielding and, in fact, in secondary research analysis. I normally stay up late at night staring at tables. But actually what I found myself wanting in the issue, and something perhaps to think about a little bit more purposely for other issues, is what I call small N research. In virtually all of the papers, if they're not presenting ideas, they are data crunching. And small N research has to be done very carefully because it can essentially disintegrate into what I call evidence by argument making as opposed to evidence assessing making. But small N research does get us back to talking about processes, particularly processes of integration. Large-scale analysis of data, as we all know, those of us in the room, allows us to connect boxes. It allows us to think sequentially. It allows us to say antecedent, consequent, and sometimes if we're really trying to have huge leaps of faith, we do it causally. A precedes B, therefore A causes B. But we sometimes don't know very much about what are in these little boxes. We know that education is associated with higher earnings. And it's a lot of the research that is done with small cases, talking to individuals, trying to get a sense of how, what matters in their lives and what is at work to establish them or hindered them in their establishment in a country, are all about process and require different methodologies. I also didn't see anything in the issue that I would have, in the issue overall and in these 4 papers that I would have liked to have seen discussed, at least one article on, which are humanitarian flows. I realize that that's a function of just how complex the world has become, also how specialized the field of migration is. So maybe that particular kind of what's missing remark is really based on the success of IMR. There are other journals that deal with that, the CMS Journal on Migration and Human Security, there's the Journal of Refugee Studies out of Oxford, there's Migration and Refugee Studies now out of the EI, European Institute, outside of Florence. There are a number of venues for the discussion of this, but I think I would welcome a return to an assessment of the humanitarian flows, in part because I really do think that we are on the cusp of needing to discuss the governance issues that were raised. The 25th anniversary, Mark Miller, shortly thereafter, had a piece that he wrote where he said, we really aren't at a stage where we can talk about migration regimes, where we have institutionalized protocols that often involve agreements between countries. And I think that is something that could be looked at later on the field. And I want to essentially also say that what I found missing, and I'm not just being a quick read of what was being said at the beginning of the conference. In fact, I found all the remarks in the conference made me feel that my brain cells still were working, because I'd come to these conclusions separately. Is I would have liked to have seen something on climate change. In my view, that will be one of the major challenges for spontaneous, unexpected flows of people that will really be on potentially on the level of humanitarian crises that flow out of civil unrest and terrorism. I also would have liked to have seen one article that assessed the transformative nature of immigration. And this term was not simply borrowed from Archbishop Tomasi. It actually was something that my husband, who had spent 3 years at the Gregorian, muttered about when we were talking. He said, no one's studying the transformative nature of immigration. You know, the terminology may go back to Rome, but it is still very much a tour de force in terms of what we need to look at. I think it's understood that why it's not in the immigration issue today. International Migration Review was established to look at immigration largely as a dependent variable. Fertility had been important, but now immigration was important. And when we start saying, what's the transformative nature of immigration, we're shifting that balance more to where we're saying, what are the consequences of immigration? In fact, we still can talk about the transformative nature of immigration and talk about immigrants, because immigration is transformative not just for the sending country that loses individuals, it's not just transformative for the destination country that gains immigrants at a time when, as Richard Alba and Nancy Bonner point out in their article, fertility rates are declining, the population is aging, there are seismic shifts in the diversity composition of these populations. It's also transformative for the migrants. And so I think we can incorporate that transformative nature of immigration into research agendas in the future. I finally want to conclude by thanking the group of people that have been passionately committed to IMR, that have brought it, have essentially seen its birth, have stayed with it. I've already alluded to the tremendous energy and commitment of Lidio and Silvano Tomasi, but I think that we need to look at the Mark Millers, we need to look the Joe Shamies, we need to look at Ellen Crawley, we need to look at Don, who has been shepherding IMR through the aegis of the Center for Migration Studies. I started my career in the 1970s. By 1976, I was asked to be a member of the editorial board, something that struck me as unusual for a young scholar, but that I passionately embraced. I have loved my journey through life with IMR, and I want to thank everybody for making that possible. Thank you.
As you may have suspected, we are actually running over time, and so I don't want to shortchange our terrific panelists and who gave really great presentations. It's okay, okay. And I also want to thank Monica Boyd for giving that incredibly overview of a commentary, which I don't think many of us suspected, but we all enjoyed. So what I thought we'd do is maybe just take just comments or questions, and then we can, the panelists can mull over them, and you can get them at the gala with your drinks and continue to badger them. So,
And push it to gala.
okay. So questions. And again, if you could identify yourself and keep the, let us know to whom the question is directed.
Hi, I'm Juan Trevino, visiting from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. I'm here at CUNY. And great presentation, really enjoyed the four of them. The questions are directed to Matthew and Nancy and Richard. I think that what I understood from skimming through the chapters and from the presentations, is how multiculturalism seems to work better in North America, Australia, New Zealand, vis-a-vis European countries. Because of culture, history, identity issues, etc., etc. So I have a normative and provocative question about this. Do you think that Europe should start forgetting about multiculturalism? Should they rethink the model towards, I don't know, interculturalism or something like that? And thank you.
This is another question.
Thank you. John Barry from Queen's University in Canada. My question is on the same topic and directed to the same presenters. In particular, Matthew, you said very early on that multiculturalism policy is concerned with the promotion of cultural diversity. But you also, in your written paper, note that those societies that were first into the multiculturalism game, Canada, Australia, and Sweden, promoted two big ideas: that cultural diversity is good for society, good for communities, and good for individuals. At the same time, multiculturalism also means the promotion of equitable participation of all communities and individuals in the diverse society. But you continue to focus on diversity in your presentation, and where you found advantages for the societies such as Canada and Australia, you implied that this was due to diversity. But I would like to suggest to you that it could also be to the equitable participation efforts in these societies, and in fact may be even more important than the diversity promotion in those societies. The countries that entered into the multiculturalism game later, like Netherlands and the UK, of course, only were concerned with that first big idea, diversity, and really failed to promote equitable participation. And that's perhaps why they are moving away with a sense of failure, perhaps their tail dragging behind them. Thank you very much.
And there's another question here.
I'm still Jack Eichenbaum, Hunter College. 1965 is this explanation and question is particularly directed at Professor Hoot. 1965 is a critical year in New York. Two things happened at the same time. It's the second year of our last World's Fair, and also the change in the immigration laws, the Hart-Celler Act, and a lot of the people who worked at that World's Fair from other countries were some of our first new immigrants, started some of the new immigrant neighborhoods in Queens. I am the Queensboro historian, and one of the things that I study is immigrant history in Queens since 1965, and I have watched the neighborhoods change. I'm an old man already, so I've been through all this. I watched it change. For years, I called Queens the center of global diversity. The symbol of that fair was the Unisphere, if you recall. And there were the population of Queens is 50% foreign-born. Population of the city is 37% foreign-born. Since the 60s, Queens has quadrupled in its percentage. The city as a whole has doubled in its percentage. 3 million people are foreign-born in New York City, and about 1.2 million of them are in Queens. There are not just 136 languages spoken at home, but there are immigrant neighborhoods all over the city large enough to provide you with the food, the groceries, the cultural entertainment, etc., and you can see them on the streets. I use the term Queens as the center of global diversity for years and years and years. In the last year, I've been using a different term. I call it the center of global hybridization. Not just we have these and those, but we have collaborations between them. I mean, there are kosher restaurants, there are halal Chinese restaurants, there are cultural groups that are coming together to make new music, new dance, And there's such a collaboration between immigrants on voluntary levels. It's unprecedented, and this is the center of global hypersecurity. And I'm just wondering what your perspective on that is.
We are panelists, a great round of applause, and also to our discussions, and also to thank the audience members for being